What I've been reading. I have been reading The Book of Jose, a memoir by Fat Joe. Fat Joe, for those of you who don't know, is a rapper from New York, specifically the Bronx. He's responsible for many hits, spanning like 2 or 3 decades. A few of the mainstream hits are like All the Way Up, featuring Remy Ma and French Montana. What's Love, featuring Ashanti. Lean Back, I Make It Rain, featuring Lil Wayne, etc., etc., etc. He's also the founder of the Terror Squad, which is responsible for acts like Big Pun and Remy Ma. And I'm definitely a Fat Joe fan, not just his music, but his personality and his interviews, of which there are many that folks can definitely check out. But most of all, his backstory and turning negatives into positives, with the main ingredient of that being hard work and dedication. And I love stories like that. And before I share a few of my personal favorite takeaways from reading his book, I actually want to read you guys the official synopsis, the summary, which is a bit long, but I think it does a good job of breaking down the book. Quote, Grammy-nominated, multi-platinum selling artist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist Fat Joe pulls back the curtain on his larger-than-life persona in this gritty, intimate memoir about growing up in the South Bronx and finding his voice through music. Fat Joe is a hip-hop legend, but this is not a tale of celebrity. It is the story of Joseph Cartagena, a kid who came of age in the South Bronx during its darkest years of drugs, violence, and abandonment, and how he navigated that traumatizing landscape until he found, through art, friendship, luck, and will, a rocky path to a different life. Joe was born into a sprawling Puerto Rican and Cuban family, which I didn't know, by the way, about Fat Joe. I didn't know he was half Cuban. I thought he was straight Puerto Rican. But he was born into a sprawling Puerto Rican and Cuban family in the projects of the South Bronx. From infancy, his life is threatened by violence. And by the time he starts middle school, he is faced with the grim choice that defined a generation: to become predator or prey. Soon, Joe and his crew dominate the streets, but he finds his true love among the park jams where the Bronx's wild energy takes musical form. His identity splits in two: a hustler roaming record stores looking for beats, and a budding rapper whose violent rep rings in the streets. As Joe's day-to-day life becomes more fraught with betrayal, addiction, and death, until he himself is shot and almost killed, he gravitates toward the music that gives him both a voice to tell the stories of his young life and the tools he needs to create a new one. The challenges never stop, but neither does Joe. This memoir, written in Joe's own intensely compelling voice, moves with the momentum of Pulp Fiction, but underneath the tragic comedy and riveting tales of the streets and the industry, which is a thought-provoking story about a generation of survivors raised in warlike conditions, the life and death choices they had to make, the friends they lost and mourned, and the glittering lives they created from the ruins. And that is the official synopsis. So yeah, I listened to the audiobook. He narrates it himself, which you can tell is not his strong suit. He definitely has that, larger than life Fat Joe personality that comes off and shines through in like interviews and stuff like that. So his narration of the actual audiobook definitely grows on you. Yeah, at least it did for me. This was a fun read, and it's a memoir, which I'm into. Shout out to Elaine, Spun Today alum, that highlighted that to me when we were having a conversation about books or something like that, and I mentioned a bunch of memoirs without like making the connection that they're all memoirs. And she was like, "Oh, you like memoirs?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" But yeah, I definitely do. Some of the types of books that I get like most into, and I think it's similar to my like love for podcasts and like interviews that are like free form, is that I'm really into how the sausage gets made, the behind the scenes stuff, like how did this person become this person, how did that thing become that thing, what's the story behind this song, etc. What's the story behind this book, this story. And I just love stuff like that. This book is definitely chock full of stuff like that, anecdotes and stories, some of which I've heard in the past, again, from Fat Joe's like interviews and stuff like that, or just hip hop stories in general. But it definitely goes like much deeper, and I learned a lot that I didn't know before. like just a shitload of the different types of trauma that he went through as a kid. And obviously this story is a memoir told from Fat Joe's perspective. And that's obviously just one side of, or one perspective of each of these stories, but they are his. Like, for example, he had an older brother, or has an older brother, which was his half brother, who was really smart, but wasn't like a street dude. But he was really smart and had a Wall Street job. He was making like $300 a week or something like that. But he had a friend that was into the streets and selling drugs. And his friend wanted to leverage Angel's smarts to help like organize his drug empire and business and stuff like that. It didn't take much doing. He got him to leave his Wall Street gig and start selling drugs, because he went from making $300 a day to making around $300 a week on Wall Street to making around $500 a day. But he had the all too common tragic story of going from that trajectory of $300 a week in an honest job to $500 a day selling drugs, to getting, rising the ranks and in this drug selling organization, which ultimately ended with him getting 47 of his cars repossessed, over $1 million stolen that he had in cash, stolen from his best friend who he was stashing the money with, to him being hooked on drugs, in and out of jail throughout his life, and currently blind from just like all the like drug use and stuff like that. No matter how many times he went, he was like in and out of rehab. So cautionary tale there. But an aspect of Joe's life that I definitely didn't know about. In the book also, Joe breaks down his the story about when he was shot. I've heard the story multiple times before, and I'm sure many of you have as well. You can easily, basically, was some dude who was supposedly like a herb in the neighborhood that he had lent money to, and he would see him and tell him like, yo, where's my money? And like fuck with him a bit, but he wasn't really serious because it wasn't a lot of money. But supposedly one day during, I forget if it was the actual like Puerto Rican Day Parade or if it was 4th of July or something like that, but it was like the summertime. A lot of people were outside hanging out or whatever. But he sees this dude when he's going into the store. Then the dude had a large jacket on in the middle of the summer. So this dude has on this trench coat in the middle of the summer, and Fat Joe didn't put like two and two together. But he goes into the store, something comes back out, and the guy pulls out a gun. And then Joe just bolts. He just starts running. And the dude is chasing him and like taking shots and shooting. Remember, there's like mad people on the street. And then Joe sees like a bunch of kids or something playing in one direction. Then he runs in the opposite direction because he doesn't want he said that he didn't want the dude that was shooting, who was obviously shooting recklessly, to hit one of the little kids or something. And then he winds up getting shot in the back. It goes like through his back and out his stomach or something like that. And that's that story, right? Again, you can find the full details of that pretty easily. But I say that to say sometime after that, Joe didn't snitch out the guy and say who it was or anything to the cops. And then this is the sickest part of the story, in my opinion. Sometime after that, he finds out where the guy is staying in some building in Hunts Point. And Joe goes over there with the intention of like either fucking him up or killing him or scaring him or something. And he's sitting outside his building waiting for him to come out one night. And he stays there all night and goes back home in the morning. The guy never comes out. And then when Fat Joe gets home to his apartment building, the feds wind up running into the apartment, Joe's apartment, thinking that Fat Joe was his older brother, Angel. And they were looking for his older brother. And they saw that he wasn't there. And then one of the cops tells them, yo, what were you doing in Hunts Point all night last night? Because they were following Fat Joe thinking that it was Angel. They were looking for him, for the like all the like drug related shit. And then Joe tells him like some lie on the spot. He was like, oh, yeah, I was visiting. I was going to go see my girl or something. I heard that she was cheating on me with some guy. So I went to go see if I would see them, but I didn't. But that's crazy. Imagine if the guy would have came out of that building and, the cops were like sitting on him there. So whatever would have happened, he would have got like hemmed up for that. So I thought that was a sick story. Then, this quick aside, he grew up in the same projects as Dean Meminger, which is an anchor on New York One, Spectrum News. Shout out to Dean Meminger. They grew up in the same projects. They're around the same age. What else do I have here? Fat Joe won first place at Amateur Night at the Apollo 4 weeks in a row back in 92, which I tried to look up like videos of that to see if I could find it, and I couldn't. But if I do come across it, I'll link to it in the episode notes so you guys can check it out as well. I thought that was a pretty cool story he told. He also told a story of how he used to promote parties back in the day in clubs, and he said that he paid Biggie for his first show ever. You know, he booked them with Puff to do a show at one of his parties that he was promoting, and he said he remembers paying them $1,000 and a bottle of Moët. How far we've come, folks. A really cool story he told as well was behind the What's Love song, which was like a smash hit back in the day. He said that Irv Gotti reached out and offered him the song, and he tells the story of how, you know, Irv calls him and tells him, yo, you got to come down to the studio. I got a track that's like perfect for you. Come by. And like Joe goes and he plays it for him, and Ashanti is doing the vocals on it like as a sample. And Irv said that the song was for Fat Joe and J-Lo, but Joe liked the way Ashanti sounded on it so much that even though she was like completely unknown at that point, like she hadn't like popped off yet, Joe decided to keep Ashanti on instead, and the rest is history. And he tells the story as like an important, like pivotal moment in that, you know, it came in the wake of Big Pun passing and him being depressed and, you know, going through other like family shit that he breaks down, but not really fully focused on music. But this song and the success of it brought him back and like refocused him into it. He broke down the whole beef with 50 Cent, which they have since squashed, thankfully. But he said it stems from, you know, the story that we all know, I'm sure many of you have heard in the past, of why Ja Rule and like Murder Inc. and the whole like 50 and Eminem beef started, was related to an encounter at a recording studio where both camps were at. There was a scuffle, somebody got stabbed. The way I've heard the story told outside of this book is that, you know, they're all from Southside Jamaica, Queens. They had some like rifts and rivalries in the past. Ja Rule and Gotti and like that camp heard that 50 Cent was in the same studio with G-Unit. They went to confront them about something, and 50 wound up getting stabbed, supposedly. I've also heard the other version that Ja wound up getting stabbed, but who knows. Then unrelated to that, a short time after that, that's when 50 got shot. Supreme McGriff, who was a big-time drug dealer, kingpin, who's still locked up to this day, from Queens, supposedly financial backing for Irv Gotti and Murder Inc. and stuff like that, and some of the beef stems from that as well. And 50's beef with Supreme, who allegedly is responsible for the, you know, 50 getting shot 9 times. And 50's beef directly with Irv Gotti is that Irv Gotti supposedly tried blackballing 50 Cent like throughout the industry, telling folks like not to fuck with him, not to give him tracks, not to do songs with him, etc., which worked to an extent until M and Dre wound up signing 50 Cent to Shady Aftermath and Interscope. And then obviously 50 Cent blew the fuck up with Get Rich or Die Trying, etc. But then Fat Joe comes into the fold, into the whole beef, when like the entire music industry was like shifting towards more like pro 50 Cent in that whole like beef or issue. But because Irv Gotti was loyal in a sense to Joe and, you know, bringing him back into music with the whole What's Love track and Ashanti, etc., Fat Joe wanted to return the favor, and he said he had to stay loyal to Irv and Murder Inc. for looking out for him in his time of need, and that's why Fat Joe put Ja Rule and Jadakiss on the New York track, which was another huge song. But Fat Joe being on a track with Ja Rule was spawned the whole 50 Cent beef, and then like they had their back and forth with like tracks back and forth and stuff like that. But yeah, that was a definitely interesting breakdown from Joe's point of view as well. Switching gears to another story, everybody knows that Fat Joe is like a big sneakerhead. He has like one of the most regarded like sneaker collections, and it's something he's really into. He owns a sneaker store called Up NYC, and he actually has a lot of his family members like working at them and managing them, which I thought was pretty cool. Like I knew he was into sneakers, but I didn't know like that entrepreneurial side of it, which is pretty dope. What's crazy is that he was supposedly set to be the first rapper to do a Jordan sneaker deal, because again, like the whole, you know, him being known as a sneakerhead and stuff like that, it like dates back. And he had a $20 million Jordan sneaker deal in place to do this collaboration. And he met with MJ one-on-one a bunch of times. He met with MJ's design team as well several times. And when the whole 50 Cent beef got so public, he said that he got a call from MJ pretty much saying, yo, I'm not down with the whole, rap beef, public negativity thing, so we're going to have to pull the deal. I thought that was a sick story. And that would have been a pretty cool collaboration. I'm not particularly a sneakerhead myself, but just seeing that type of collaboration happen would have been cool. He had an interesting quote related to death, speaking about this situation with his sister, which is that his sister was pregnant. She was at the hospital, going to have a baby. And the doctor that administered the epidural fucked up. And she became a vegetable pretty much for 8 months, just breathing with respirators, couldn't move until she ultimately died, as well as the baby. And I might be off on that. I'm not sure if the baby survived or because there's mention of another nephew. And I don't remember right now if it's like the older brother or that baby that she was attempting to give birth to. So my bad on that. But long story short, they sued the hospital. They won a $2 million lawsuit, tax-free. It was the hospital being negligent and ultimately killing his sister. And he mentioned how he put that like $2 million in an annuity for his nephew. So I think it was an older nephew because he says how, his older nephew was obviously traumatized from that whole situation. But that since he didn't want like anyone in the family thinking that he like took the money from his nephew or anything like that, he just like put it in an annuity, didn't really watch it, didn't manage it for him. But the nephew got the money when he was 18 and pretty much like blew it all within a year or two. So he regrets not being as hands-on with it. But something that stayed with me was his take on like that death within his life, which was that you honor your loved ones, you keep their legacy, but you got to move on. And he has a lot more interesting stories in there. He talks about when he went to jail for a few months, which was pretty much for tax evasion. I believe he got hit up with. And that story is sick. It comes from his accountant. He had an accountant for many years that he fully trusted. Then the accountant's son got into a car accident and became a quadriplegic, and the accountant stopped practicing and, had to focus on his family. And then Joe went with a different accountant. And long story short, after almost 2 years, he goes to buy a car and finds out that his credit is complete shit. And he calls his accountant, and the accountant had been stealing from him like the entire time and not paying his mortgages, not paying any of his car notes, not paying his taxes. Then he got a new accountant, got it on like a tax payment plan, but they still charged him with like X amount of months in prison. I think he did like 5 months or something like that as part of the whole thing. Like he tells that crazy story, talks about his best friend stabbing him in the back and stealing a bunch of money from him after like a couple, or doing so for like a couple decades. Sick shit. But again, awesome background story. I love the behind the scenes aspects of folks that we may see like in the limelight, but want to know more of, or about rather, how they got to where they're at. And that, folks, was my recap and review of The Book of Jose, a memoir by Fat Joe.